Arc 5, Chapter 62, Command of the Warrior.
Gorgeous tiger!
Garfiel's consciousness was shaken harshly the moment he heard that sound. He coughed out the volumes of water he had swallowed, shook all the moisture away from his body, sight beginning to return to his brain, drowsy from oxygen starvation. This place was an underground space, both dim and frigid. The rigid stone ground was now being flooded by the volumes of water flowing in. It seemed that the turbid flow was entering the room from a hole in the wall behind him, which had allowed him to breathe fresh air. He was currently showered by a great number of gazes. In them lay unease, vigilance, dread, opposition. From the number of people before him, and the myriads of feelings in their gazes, Garfiel blearily came to the conclusion that this was one of the city's shelters. The waterway he had plummeted into was right next to that shelter, and crashing through the wall had led him to this place. As a result, along with him, water had poured into the space. At that realization, Garfiel's blurred consciousness received a shock. He jerked his head up with a start. The remembrance of the events that had transpired before he had been swept to this place, erecting the hairs on his body, he hurriedly spun his head around, rapidly searching for the giant who had plummeted into the water, entangled with him. His gaze overlapped with a young blonde boy's green eyes. A familiar face. This face made his chest tighten, followed by memories which agonized his heart. He had come face to face with the boy who had a connection with Garfiel's mother, once again. His little brother, who remained in the place where he had wanted to be, receiving the love of his mother. The sense of being startled away was once again buried under an excess of feeling. And then, an enormous splash cast up the water surrounding Garfield, and the strange form of a giant stood up in the shallow water. The enormous figure waved his arms, mercilessly slamming Garfield, staring blankly into space with them. Facing this attack, Garfield's reaction was a beat too late, and this beat proved fatal. The momentary carelessness offered the opponent a flaw, and from the God of War facing Garfield came not a half-hearted attack. In total, 8 attacks were befalling Garfield. 1 or 2 of those were blocked, however the remaining 6 slammed straight into Garfield. His face was hit, and 2 of the attacks made his body airborne. His body, floating in the air, was struck right back to the surface of the water by numerous fists smacking him from overhead. His face slammed through the water into the hard ground, his nose and teeth taking serious damage as well. The surface of the water stained with crimson, and a stream of blood flowed from Garfield's mouth and nose as he leapt to his feet.
Stop kidding around!
A roar that blew through the gaps in his mouth where some of his teeth had been, shaking away the ringing in his ears from the blows his cranium had received. A momentum of anger sweeping through this underground space. The God of War, positioned directly forward, stepped forth to welcome it. The fists of the two overlapped. Garfield turned his head, using his teeth to slash the fist which scraped his head, tearing it from wrist to elbow in one motion. Extending his right arm to grab his opponent's neck simultaneously, he gouged from there all the way to the lower abdomen. Fresh blood sprayed from the sharp incision, causing no small amount of damage to the God of War's physique. However, the God of War continued his strike with the 7 remaining hands. In order to avoid them all, it would take all that Garfield had to take evasive action. An exchange of blows in a mano-a-mano fight, and he needed to use one hand to deal with 8. Overwhelming disadvantages. Overwhelming differences in ability. Overwhelming differences in strength. This in fact ignited his will to fight. Attack, 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 attack! Block, deflect, avoid, evade, duck, kick aside, meet head on. Fist clash generating shockwaves that cause the sweat dripping from the two to evaporate. Powerful arm and sturdy arm facing off in collision. The staggering sound making it difficult to believe that this was flesh on flesh. The pair's bodies were unable to withstand this, flying outward in opposite directions. A ferocious tiger and an enormous body were both tossed aside, casting up giant splashes. Kurgan's back collided with the wall behind, and Garfield once again became intimately acquainted with the water. He immediately raised his head, his gaze overlapping with Kurgan's, who in turn was looking directly towards him. Although, without a single word spoken, mutual understanding was established in but a moment. Garfield stood, stepping into the water that now reached his ankles. Garfield could feel the power of the divine protection of earth spirits activating beneath the soles of his feet, cutting a quadrilateral from the floor underneath his feet, allowing it to float upward. Kicking aside the floating piece of floor, much of the water in the underground flowed into the huge hole he had just created, drastically reducing the water level. As Garfiel conducted the draining of the water, Kurgan approached the hole from which the water flowed in. The gap that had sent the two to the underground was enormous, vast amounts of water pouring from it. If it were left alone, the underground space would flood in a matter of minutes. Kurgan yanked out a demon cleaver. Given that one had been bitten to pieces by Garfiel, there yet remained 3 demon cleavers. Kurgan removed one tame above, his target hanging directly overhead of the hole. He hefted the exaggerated piece of iron at the ceiling, shattering it. Using his warrior's eyesight to gauge the degree of the collapse, the hole in the wall was, in this crude manner, sealed with rubble. Of course, even blocked water would still leak in, but not to an extent that the underground space would be instantaneously submerged. The hole had been plugged, the drainage had been completed, and the water that submerged their ankles was no more. Checking the status of their surroundings wordlessly, the 2 warriors returned to their original positions. Face to face. Fist outfitted with shields lifted. 3 demon cleavers drawn. The hero, Kurgan the 8 Arms, and the challenger, Garfiel the Golden Tiger. Subduing an opponent at peak condition, this was the implicit, unwritten agreement between warriors. Garfiel knew that this was not the time for such a thing. His duty was to return to the city hall that was likely under attack, to rescue those who could not fight. However, before having to face that problem, he had yet another he could not turn his back on. This sentiment was out of place, but Garfiel felt excited. He had lost to Reinhardt pitifully. He had sealed memories and feelings both for his mother. He had been unable to avenge the kind girl who had protected him. He had left an ally in a dangerous situation after having played right into the enemy's hands. So many important things had been snatched from his hands, leaving him to feel powerless and empty. Leaving the sanctuary, seeing the world, Garfiel had recognized his own weakness. He was sure that he was now much stronger compared to when he was inside the sanctuary. That was natural. Back then, his metric of comparison had only been himself, holding no doubts to the martial abilities he had trained. Leaving the sanctuary, seeing the world, Garfiel had recognized far greater strengths. Compared to his time in sanctuary, his own power had not decreased. However, he had become weaker in comparison, for the object he compared himself to was no longer a mirror image of himself. In a mere 2 days, a shift in consciousness had made him clearly come to this conclusion. Powerlessness and loss had exposed Garfiel's inner self, forcing him to recognize that he was merely a bluffing brat. Hesitation, doubt, regret all quaked his spirit, the wavering of his heart turning him weak. And who had injected life into his wilted soul had been precisely Kurgan, the hero, Kurgan the 8 Arms, the hero of the Valachian Empire, the man of paramount strength of the multi-armed tribe. Having readied his demon cleavers, he had regarded Garfiel as a warrior to face. How important this was to Garfiel, who could not find his own value. The 2 entangled men had plummeted into the waterway, Garfiel's inexperience in aquatic combat stunting his consciousness. Kurgan, having been resurrected by arcane arts, had no need to breathe, and had merely wished to decide the outcome. Waiting for Garfiel to drown would have sufficed. However, the god of war had shattered the wall of the waterway, connected that path to a shelter, and had let Garfiel survive. For what purpose?
Initially, I thought it was your show of mercy.
Originally, Kurgan had not regarded Garfiel, unprepared as the latter was, as a warrior. Flinging aside an attacking child, kicking aside a crybaby was not what a warrior would do. And thus, facing Garfiel throwing a tantrum, Kurgan had completely sidestepped him. But not now. Precisely because he had stood and raised his shields, Garfiel was now being regarded as a warrior. That was why he had witnessed the famed demon cleavers being drawn, had been met with the god of war posturing as to meet a warrior. After seeing this demeanor from him, what he had shown to Garfiel had been certainly no mere mercy or pity. What Kurgan sought was the result of a decisive battle for victory against Garfiel. The battle between warrior and warrior could only accept a mutual single blow as a conclusion.
Oi, you guys. How long are you gonna keep staring?
Garfiel checked the shields on his two arms, these words directed not towards Kurgan, but to the audience looking on, surrounding them. The ones who, after the two warriors had been swept in along with the stream, had silently regarded the battle between warriors. The refugees. Gathered together through differing in clothing, age, and even race. All they had in common was their inability to fight, being a group of non-combatants who would be sent flying with a single attack. If Garfiel fell here, there was no one here who could deal effective damage to Kurgan. Although difficult to imagine Kurgan committing atrocities against non-combatants, the only one who knew this was precisely his opponent, Garfiel. And so...
You should be able to tell at a glance. Even if you spectate from over there, there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Now, hurry and leave this place and go outside.
Gorgeous tiger?
A high-pitched cry overwhelmed Garfiel's words, urging them to leave quickly. Garfiel's brows knitted at that, as the only one to call out to Garfiel had also been the only one who happened to use this phrase. The boy's eyes were filled with tears, both cheeks crimson, gripping the hem of his clothing tightly. Faced with Garfiel's astonishing sight, the boy's watery eyes stared back. They held a will, strong enough to make it difficult for Garfiel to reply.
Hey, Lil Brat, the hell are you saying?
Gorgeous tiger! Gorgeous tiger!
The quavering voice of the boy called out so to the silent Garfiel, as if unaware of how else to express his feelings. He shouted out this name. This was the name of a golden tiger. This was the name that Garfiel Tinsel yearned for. The name of the strongest tiger. Why now was he calling this name? What did he wish to convey? Tears dripped down the reddened cheeks of the boy. Spreading through the entire underground audience were the cries of the boy, so everyone shared the inexpressible passion contained in that voice.
Alright, you've said it already. Now go.
Gorgeous tiger!
Garfiel's sigh was buried under a cry, calling for the golden tiger. From behind the boy, a girl with the same golden hair embraced him, the boy's sister. As if to protect her younger brother, her gaze trembled as it found Garfiel. Her lips also trembled without a pause, and a voice without sound of silence, calling the name of the Tiger of Gold.
Win! For sure!
Not from the boy, not from the girl, of course not from Garfiel. Another man in the underground space, screaming while clenching his fists.
Wait, I told you to run.
Fight and win!
Don't lose!
We can only watch, but...
Garfiel was speechless. The voice he used to urge them to flee was repeatedly buried under other voices, directing his attention back. The enthusiasm in the boy's voice had reached the hearts of everyone underground, not a single person of those watching Garfiel and Kurgan's duel making a move to flee. In terms of common sense, in terms of coolly thinking it through, how could anyone think staying was the correct option? Everyone had left themselves to the heat of things, solely for the sake of meaningless determination and faith. They had reached a conclusion likely to cost them their own selves.
What the hell's this?
Was what Garfiel was thinking. What was the point of staying here? What was making noise, showing support supposed to mean? It would be much better to hurry and run. They would not have to worry about getting involved, and the likelihood that they would be sacrificed should he himself fall would reduce. It was much more rational. But not a one of them fled. And why was that?
Captain! Sure enough, your speech was way too effective.
He remembered the words Natsuki Subaru had conveyed to the entire city. Having touched the hearts of everyone in the city, the strength of Subaru's weakness had pulled together the people, submerged by unease and horror. A feeble fire had been ignited with the last bit of hope, and that starter continued to warm up the people's hearts, waiting for the next opportunity to burn larger. And for them, the moment for that was now, and in this moment, the same went for Garfiel.
Gorgeous tiger!
The cheering would not cease. The first to call out to the golden tiger had been Garfiel's little brother, whose birth he had been unaware of, and protecting her littlest brother was the little sister, whose birth had likewise been unknown to Garfiel. Little brother and little sister were looking directly at Garfiel, the city that had welcomed his mother after she had lost her memory. Its residents were looking directly at Garfiel.
For a duel between warriors, compared to the usual, it's been noisy. Really sorry. Been troubling you all along. Especially most troublesome are my amazing selves, little bro and sis. They'll get a proper scolding after this. And so...
Wordlessly, the god of war readied his stance, fighting spirit booming. Wordless, but that attitude spoke 1,000 words. Garfiel clenched his fist, knocking the shields attached to his arms together. The sound of steel striking steel lit a spark. Through his fangs, Garfiel took a deep breath.
The Shield of Sanctuary. Nah. Gorgeous tiger! Garfiel Tinsel.
The announcement of a name. That initiated the duel between warriors. To Garfiel's announcement of a name, Kurgan remained silent. However, the god of war merely scraped his demon cleavers, showing his opponent the utmost of will to battle. That was enough. Garfiel kicked against the stone floor, causing it to explode, his body rushing forward. Kurgan greeted him with the same, the distance between the two reducing to 0 in a mere instant. Too sharp to call it a smack, too blunt to call it a slash. The strike was something in between. The air that the demon cleavers touched was not whistled through, nor sliced so much as it was killed. The blade's deadliness was perceived by Garfiel due to the danger instinct of a warrior. In one exchange of blows, he needed to contend with 8 hands, and those 8 hands only needed to contend with 1. With the number of Garfiel and Kurgan's hands differing, to win against him was to Garfiel as difficult as scaling a peak to reach the heavens. However, without effort, he could not reach it, and so he initiated this battle, gambling his all. Faced with heavy blows which made his body their target, if hit directly, even a blunt blow would be enough to sever his blood and flesh. Without the slightest of hesitation, Garfiel lifted his foot, shattering a demon cleaver speeding towards him with a single step. Directly overhead, the heel broke the body of the demon cleaver, the thick body of the blade piercing through the stone floor, the roar of the splitting rocks creating an illusion that a quake shook the entire city. He had dealt with 1 in his first move, but he must not let his guard down. At the same time that the broken demon cleaver had pierced the floor, the second one cut an arc through the air from the direction of his opponent's left shoulder. Upon hearing the whistle of the demon cleaver with his right ear, Garfiel immediately defended his head with both the shields strapped on his arms. The attack hit exactly in the instant he raised his arms, blanking his consciousness for an instant. The impact received by his right arm fractured his elbow, his wrist and upper arm also shattering completely. Garfiel gritted his teeth, to the extent that his teeth dripped blood. That was the second hand. The third and fourth hands were empty, striking simultaneously. Because of his gargantuan body, Kurgan's clenching fists were no smaller than the size of a child's skull. The power of a cannonball, allied to the size of a cannonball. The power of that blow could be said to equate to that of a warship's. A fist that felt capable of piercing even a stone wall or a plate of iron approached Garfiel. His thoughts gone blank after the impact to his head, one aiming towards his body and one towards his head. Either one was capable of exploding a human with a clean hit. The blow concentrated on Garfiel's body burned as it scraped across his abdomen. The fist seared as if scorched in flame. Such was the unnatural power. Twisting his body, this fist had only scraped away the skin on the surface of his abdomen. That was the third hand. A feeling as if having half his body plaguing his consciousness. With his right hand, Garfiel blocked the punch headed right at his face. His right arm, already broken and shattered, completely burst open under this tremendous force. Elbow to wrists to tips of fingers. This hand no longer looked like a hand. The shield affixed to the wrist was sent flying as well. But losing a hand was hardly a fatal wound. Garfiel arched his body to meet the fist with his forehead, smashing Kurgan's fist with a headbutt. He had avoided the blow from the fourth hand. Remaining were the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. Still distant, too distant. Distant enough to make one laugh, to make one shiver to their fangs. The fifth and sixth hands were empty as well. One demon cleaver yet remained, and a decisive wound had yet to be made. Both these hands were left hands, each protruding from under the shoulder and the side of the body, attacking at the same time. The right hand that he had blocked with was now useless. His left hand could not make it in time. And so, Garfiel unhesitatingly stuck his right foot forward, soles of his shoes drawing a splash, at the same time conveying his will to the earth. On occasion, the earth lent him strength. On occasion, it aligned with his whims. And this time too, it offered him its own power. From a tilt under his feet, Kurgan's lower body lost its balance. Even so, without pause, the god of war righted himself. His movements were without a trace of hesitation, not wavering in the slightest. However, in his concentration there appeared a break. In the instant Kurgan's attention shifted below to his feet, Garfiel rushed forward, seizing the opportunity. Lifting his foot with a twist of his body, shoving his head between the two approaching fists, as if in the eye of a storm, the two fists aiming for his torso both swept behind his body. The instant his feet were set on the ground, Garfiel shuddered for his own judgment. He himself unsure of why he would have made that judgment. A thought and a decision accomplished in a fraction of a measure of time. Brain scorching, heart scorching, life on the verge of bursting. The fifth and sixth hands were thus dealt with. Afterward, the seventh and the eighth hands. Suddenly, the entirety of Garfiel's bodily hair stood up. Kurgan, whose 6 hands had been dodged, would want to use the remaining 2 to finish Garfiel. A fatal blow cometh. Skipping over the 7th hand, the 8th and last hand struck. He had stopped an attack with one hand, instead using it to wield the Demon Cleaver. Right arm held the pommel of the Demon Cleaver. Right shoulder's hand tightly gripped the body of the Demon Cleaver's blade. A blow that surpassed powerful was about to welcome Garfiel, who stood grounded. Surrounded on all sides, such overwhelming presence that one would believe that they would die no matter where they tried to escape to. This was a sight that made the attacks of the previous 6 hands, that he had done his utmost to evade, seem almost a waste. Avoiding was unimaginable. Backing away, leaping aside, or rushing forward, those would all result in a direct hit. An image of being turned into a slab of meat as a result of this attack appeared before his eyes. Escape was impossible. Attacking would be even more reckless. There was only one option, and so, Garfiel placed his unbroken left hand above his head, dropping his waist. In this moment, there were voices that remained audible still. The sound of little brother and little sister, and a large crowd of people cheering. Judgment in a moment, moving in an instant. The result was immediate. At the time the Demon Cleaver had been unleashed, Garfiel had entirely left this world. All-encompassing silence, all-encompassing color. Extraneous surroundings vanished in the blink of an eye. In Garfiel's consciousness, his focus sharpened to its absolute limit, remained only Kurgan. With abnormal sluggishness, the edge of the Demon Cleaver slashed downward towards Garfiel. With identical sluggishness, Garfiel moved, having raised his head and preparing to receive the blow. In a world so stagnant as to induce anxiousness, all Garfiel could do was tightly clench his teeth. Wrong. There was still time to delve into his memories. He saw Subaru, saw Ram. He could see Mimi. He could see Frederica. Remembered Ryuzu. Recalled Amelia. Otto appeared too. The thought of that bastard Roswell floated around. Could gaze Beatrice and Petra, and everyone from the sanctuary. And then, his mother Ratia, his little brother, and his little sister. The battle that had taken place at Sanctuary had allowed Garfiel to realize his own weakness, realizing the breadth of the world upon being defeated by Reinhard. Garfiel had adopted the wrong impression that he was weaker than he had been before leaving Sanctuary. That was impossible. If embracing more meant more weakness, then for what reason did people live on? Being strong enough to protect everything you embraced was enough.
Feeling refreshed.
Suddenly, the irritation plaguing his heart fell away. That instant, the demon cleaver struck the shield on his raised left arm, sending a jolt which felt like lightning throughout his entire body. The defense mounted by his left arm was in an instant broken down by that demon cleaver. Just like his destroyed right arm, the wrist, elbow, bicep, even shoulder were all twisted beyond repair. Feeling the familiar pain of a shattered arm as if in a nightmare, agony dyed his vision red, thoughts soldering into complete blankness. Garfiel opened his mouth to form a howl. The fangs that had been clenched all along loosened, a chorus of despair for each accumulated wound starting to form. The demon cleaver's momentum did not perish. After shattering his left hand, the momentum that remained approached Garfiel's neck. Such power would be enough to shatter Garfiel's small body, leaving him nothing but minced meat. Just how did the god of war regard this young warrior who gave agonized wails as if meeting a dead end? In his heart was mercy or pity. Neither mattered. Unless one side stopped drawing breath, the principle of a warrior having mercy on a warrior existed not. Garfiel howled from agony as he lowered his head. The sound of that heart-rending sound persisted for a long time, and then... the howl stopped. Garfiel clenched his jaw. On the teeth that he had clenched down on again shone a radiance of silver. That was the silver shield that had fallen from his ruined right arm, which Garfiel had caught in his teeth. Whipping his head around, still biting that shield, Garfiel had met the demon cleaver slashing towards his face. The second line of defense posed by that shield was crushed the instant the attack had reached it, slamming it into the side of his face. Blood sprayed from Garfiel's nose, his teeth sent flying, but his knees did not buckle. He supported the weight of the demon cleaver with the strength of his jaw and neck. Sparks, born of the collision between steel and steel, they created a flame, causing Garfield's consciousness to flicker. Even though the whites of his eyes had begun to show, just what kind of willpower was still, even now, supporting his neck? Was it instinct for battle? Or rather, a beast's fighting spirit or even vitality? Suddenly, blood spurted out. Vast volumes of blood poured forth, crimson flowers of blood blooming in this underground space. It sprayed from Kurgan's right hand, the last right hand which clutched the demon cleaver. On it was a wound that had persisted since the last time he had attacked Garfiel, deep enough that bone was visible from hand to upper arm. From this blow just now, the wound had completely split open. Kurgan's face bore no shock, nor did his expression change due to the pain. That was a matter of course. He was a corpse. Pain existed for the sake of urging people to live, to ensure that the candlelight of life still existed beyond the minimum limit. The deceased did not need such a tool. And thus, Kurgan had ignored the effect of the injury on his right arm. If he truly wished to perform the most perfect attack, the last blow should have been given up to his still healthy left hand. That it proved to be the difference between victory and defeat was not correct to say. However, having withstood attacks from 8 hands, Garfiel heaved a sigh with a bloodied face. The shield clenched between his teeth clattered to the ground. Kurgan's front was wide open, all his arms having been used. Yet Garfiel's left and right were completely useless, the muscles in both legs torn here and there, insufficient to withstand repeated heavy blows. Even so, he could still leap one step. After leaping over, what to do? Hands could not be made use of. Then remaining was... Garfiel let out a cry, opened his bleeding mouth wide, and rushed to Kurgan. Garfiel's teeth sank into the neck of the stationary god of war, teeth piercing through tight muscles with ease, severing at the base those organs so vital to life. Still biting down like this, Garfiel twisted his body, teeth shredding through muscle and sinew, tearing away a large chunk of neck, crunching with force. Utterly defenseless, Garfiel collapsed on the ground, spitting out shredded flesh. He turned his head as he vomited, watching Kurgan's figure as blood gushed from its neck. Garfiel's arms were crushed. Several teeth were missing. Body remained stained in blood. Having been mortally injured by a Garfiel covered in wounds, heroically, Kurgan's body remained yet standing with chest upright. This was a hero spirit, so moving as it was of the human heart. Finally, Kurgan turned slowly, facing Garfiel, facing the warrior who lay on the ground gazing up at him. The god of war crossed his arms over his chest in silence, and then,
Magnificent.
in a baritone low and heavy, the victor was commended. Without even allowing him time to reply, Kurgan's body collapsed right before Garfiel's own two widened eyes. Collapsing like sand was the figure so large one needed to crane their neck to see. Alien face becoming stone and ash. Such an end inspired such grief. The deceased dying once more. This was the result.
Such pleasant words.
Watching the god of war crumble to ash as he died, Garfiel sighed in discontent. Not that he wished for him to live on so unnaturally, but after a mutual duel to the death, a feeling of emptiness at the end was natural. And so, this was merely a grief that Garfiel had nowhere else to express.
Damn it. Fuck. I'm gonna die.
He had shed too much blood. Laying on the ground, Garfiel channeled power through the divine protection of earth spirits into his entire body, turning the mana he was gathering into healing magic to repair his body. His hands especially, and his face, were a disaster too. Above ground he had suffered wounds that had yet to be healed, immediately followed up by such a number of attacks. Being left with heavy injuries was not such a surprise.
Gorgeous tiger!
Garfiel, who had been putting his all into healing, heard a sobbing cry. Treading puddles to approach were the figures of little brother and little sister. Others approached as well, but in Garfiel's eyes were only those two. Both looked to be on the verge of tears. No, they were already crying. It could not be helped. Even from a layman's point of view, Garfiel's condition was disastrous. And even to someone familiar with this sight, that he remained alive was practically unimaginable. If looked at by a healer, their faces would surely turn into a terrified white, determining that emergency treatment would be needed. This also served as proof that he had tread the line between life and death. That's how deathly he looked. Of course, although he wanted to feel proud of it.
Survived, but couldn't buy a bit of time.
Even having defeated Kurgan the Eight Arms did not mean he had succeeded in delaying. This had been Garfiel's battle, but it was not solely his battle. During the time Garfiel had been stuck in battle, perhaps an ally had sunk into danger. Needing to return to the city hall, Garfiel sat up. Hearing his words and heeding his behavior, the expressions of the little brother and little sister who had rushed over changed. The little sister especially wore a look of rage.
Are you stupid? Alright, lie down already. Right away. Yes, right away. Right away, I'll go call a doctor over.
There are other guys needing doctors. My amazing self's got other things to do, little girl.
Garfiel nodded at his little sister whose face had turned bright red, but his face full of fresh blood perhaps did not look very convincing. The little sister ceaselessly wept anguished tears. During this time, wretchedly broken bones in his arms reconnected. Although the flesh had yet to recover fully, running a few steps would not have him passing out. Having reached this conclusion, Garfiel climbed to his feet.
Wait a minute. Are you really going to go?
The broadcast. Did you hear it too?
Garfiel's words received a nod as a response, as blood dripped from his fingertips. The voice on the broadcast had given little brother and little sister courage, giving Garfiel his last shove here. And so, Garfiel needed to repay the voice from the broadcast. He said it would be fine. Subaru said it would be fine, and so he had to make it fine.
And so, my amazing self.
With a stagger, his blood-deprived body knelt to the ground. Little sister hurriedly supported the body that appeared as if it would fall any second, and Garfiel clicked his tongue. And then, standing before Garfiel now was little brother.
Gorgeous tiger?
What's up? Sorry. If you're gonna tell me to stop, it won't work.
That's not it. Gorgeous tiger, your clothes are glowing.
Hearing the little brother's allegation, Garfiel looked down and finally noticed. At the waist of his own ragged clothing, a piece of cloth gave off a gentle glow. Stowed there was the conversation mirror. Because it had not been able to connect with the city hall, he had shoved it there, determining it was useless. Its shining right now meant...
I thought it was broken.
I'll pick that up.
Garfiel exhaled large volumes. The little sister reached towards his waist and pulled the conversation mirror out before she could be stopped. The surface of the mirror shined, which allegedly meant that another conversation mirror from elsewhere was calling this one. In other words, this was either the city hall or the other group calling his group.
What should I do?
Bring it here. Who's that?
The little sister carefully brought the mirror close to Garfiel. Garfiel looked at the mirror's surface and called out. The conversation mirror slowly began to flash.